Okay, so on this moment of despair, at the bottom of page 18, we go to a tragic moment for Meg, to be honest. I read this as a really kind of sad moment that also contains an element of comedy, obviously. She says, "Stan, what? Am I really succulent?" And there's a really uncomfortable quality here that she's obviously registered that this word has some sort of sexual connotation in the previous dialogue that has led her to criticise him for using it. But there is a sense here that she thinks it's a positive adjective, and that what we see, I think, more than anything, is her vulnerability through this desire for some sort of affirmation, and maybe to seem attractive as well. There's obviously a real kind of Oedipal Freudian subtext to this moment. But there's a real tragedy involved in a grown woman asking a question of this nature. And it's almost hilarious and tragic at the same time. And that's part of that overall absurdist aesthetic of presenting you with things that seem everyday and mundane and comic, ridiculous, but at the same time are really deeply, deeply sad. And there's a real sadness about this, that someone could feel so inadequate, that both a combination of inadequate and to be unintelligent enough to not realise that a word of this nature is not really a kind of complimentary adjective to describe someone with if you were authentically complimenting them. And that again shows us how unreliable language is and how willfully we will deceive ourselves into the meanings of language, particularly in spoken form, in dialogue. But Stanley obviously, again, pounces on this opportunity because it's an opportunity for further manipulation of Meg. And he follows on from this. "Oh, you are. I'd rather have you than a cold in the nose any day." And there's something extremely sexual about this particular phrase. "I'd rather have you than a cold in the nose any day." You're just saying that. So that exchange at the top of page 19, I think, is the moment where the Oedipal quality of their relationship is most heavily evident. But there's a very quick turn, and I think the internal conflict in Stanley is very, very stark at this moment in time. We see that through that minimalistic stage direction, violently saying, "Look, why don't you get this place cleared up? It's a pigsty. And another thing, what about my room? It needs sweeping, it needs papering, I need a new room." And I think in that sudden transformation from sexually manipulative to violently hostile and violently dictatorial is an exposure of his internal conflict and the great sense of guilt that I think he probably experiences for taking advantage of someone like Meg and her positive intentions and her weaknesses. And this, again, prefigures what occurs in the interrogation, where Stanley's weaknesses are attacked relentlessly by two society figures that represent orthodoxy. And so what we see again here is some more further audience distancing of having moments where people's own sense of internal conflict and their own sense of inadequacy leads to their own hostility. And again, that has so much in common with Blanche's hostility in that opening act, where her own internal conflict and her own self-loathing motivates her outbursts, and it's Stella that is on the receiving end of those primarily in that particular section of the play. Meg here, and this is, I think, the kind of the Oedipal apex of the play, strokes his arm in a sensual manner, so it's not reassuring. Pinter could very clearly use a different way of describing this. It could be comforting, reassuring, but it's sensual. It's supposed to be quite sexual and suggestive. "Oh, Stan, that's a lovely room. I've had some lovely afternoons in that room." So there's a really deliberately sexual suggestion about Meg's body language and behaviour here. And then we see that same disgusted reaction from Stanley. He recoils from her hand in disgust. He finds it horrifying to be treated in a way that turns their relationship into something sexually suggestive. because it is quite clearly wrong, but he is guilty of at least encouraging some of that, because he sees there to be some sort of selfish gain possible in that for him. Meg says later, "Is the sun shining?" And Stanley crosses to the window. And I think this is a really key moment in terms of his mental state. He's occupying in physical space on the stage what would be called a liminal territory. It's on the boundary between this claustrophobic internal environment, and the outside world that he has so clearly reverted from and is trying to escape. And at this moment in time, I think there's a suggestion of him weighing up the advantages and disadvantages, because he's obviously been pushed to his limit of tolerance by Meg's increasingly kind of sexual behaviour towards him. He takes a cigarette and matches and smokes it. And Meg again asks a pointless question: "What are you smoking?" "A cigarette. Are you going to give me one?" "No." And I think this is a very clear, stark contrast to Petey's dialogue with her, where his great tolerance and his understanding of her is always one step ahead of a further pointless question by Meg, whereas Stanley here just lets her ask these pointless questions and just bluntly answers them, and answers them in closed answers. So he lets Meg's stupid questions receive the answers that they deserve, the kind of stupid answers, and I think that shows his frustration with her. And he says, "I like cigarettes." He stands at the window smoking. She crosses behind him and tickles the back of his neck. "Tickle, tickle." And he tries to shove her away from him because of this disturbing sexual connotation. And this is where I think his power in the scene is at its peak. He says, "Get away from me." And then she changes the subject and says, "Are you going out?" And he just says, "Not with you. But I'm going shopping in a minute. Go. You'll be lonely all by yourself." "Will I? Without your old Meg? I've got to get things in for the two gentlemen." So there's this, just before she drops that bombshell in the last line, this is where he's at the peak of his power, and he just is sick of the sight of her. So at this moment where he is contemplating the outside world and orthodoxy, that is the moment where Meg dramatically creates this reversal in power. There's an extreme sense of panic on Stanley's part that follows her honest confession that she's got to go and get things ready for the two gentlemen who are coming to stay in the boarding house. Stanley's reaction is incredibly revealing. There's a pause, and Stanley slowly raises his head. He speaks without turning. "What two gentlemen?" So there's an immediate sense of hesitation and fear that Pinter creates through the stage directions. "I'm expecting visitors," and he turns. So now she is being slightly cryptic with him, but I don't think it's intentional. She's just speaking in the way that she knows fit. But here there is a kind of cryptic quality to her language that obviously is creating frustration in Stanley because of his innate sense of guilt, that adds to, I think, the sensation early on in the play that he has in fact done something wrong, when we later find out that really he hasn't. But at this moment in time, his immediate paranoid, guilty reaction again feeds into that sense that there's something wrong with Stanley, that we ought to be suspicious of him. But this is a dramatic power reversal in this particular moment in time, and we could think of that again as comparable to the moment where Stanley returns to the apartment in Streetcar. And there is that dramatic transformation of Stella's authority, of Blanche's authority in that particular scene. So Stanley says, "What? You didn't know that, did you?" And Meg has obviously cottoned on to the fact that he's bothered now, that she has something that he wants, and is enjoying the fact that really he's asking her questions purely because he needs to find out and he feels guilty about something, but really she's enjoying it purely because it's a form of attention for her from him. And then she explains what's going on. Two gentlemen ask Petey if they could come and stay for a couple of nights. "I'm expecting them." She picks up the duster and begins to wipe the cloth on the table. I think, again, that stage direction is a sign, I think, that she's expecting Stanley to react. She's going back to her little ritual, waiting for a reaction. I don't believe it. It's true. I think there's something quite revealing about his hostility here, the hostility that he reveals to her and his dismissal of the fact that there could be visitors, I think, exposes him as being hypocritical because of his earlier criticism of Meg for not having any visitors. So he criticizes her earlier in the play for not having any visitors, and then the moment where she reveals to him that there are a couple on the way, he shows a kind of dismissive attitude towards it. He moves towards her and says, "You're saying it on purpose." And I think this is a key line in revealing his absolute paranoia here, because he knows that she's not capable of this type of interpersonal manipulation. She doesn't have the interpersonal intelligence to be able to manipulate someone's feelings. And so that gives us, I think, a great exposure of his paranoia. And then this dialogue that follows, I think, creates an ironic reversal of the dynamics of questioning that we've seen throughout the scene, with Stanley in a kind of authoritative position and Meg in a position of inferiority because of her intelligence. Stanley's grinding his cigarette, so again, you can see that sense of frustration and anger and perhaps paranoia and anxiety in this stage direction. When was this? When did he see them? 2 questions in one line. Again, that barrage of questioning shows us his paranoia and his anxiety, and Meg answers simply last night. So now she's being just as kind of cryptic as he was in the beginning of the play. Who are they? I don't know. Didn't he tell you their names? No. And there's a wicked irony to this here, is that Meg really is being honest, but she appears to be being cryptic. And of course, when Stanley's been a bit cryptic earlier on in the play, he's actually being manipulative. So there's a sense of kind of dialogic karma here. The dialogue that he unleashes into the play earlier on in the act comes back to kind of bite him on the butt here. He's treated in the same way that he treats Meg. He begins pacing the room here, pacing the room. He's absolutely paranoid. Here, they wanted to come here. Yes, they did. She takes the curlers out of her hair. Why? This house is on the list. So there's a kind of comic element to this, that even though they've had this dialogue already and Meg's given him a ludicrous reason that he knows is not true, she uses it back at him. And he knows he's going to get a banal answer. So he's being punished here by Meg's banality. But who are they? You'll see when they come. And again, she seems like she's being deliberately evasive, but she doesn't know either. And I think is only partly relishing this scenario because Stanley's paying her some form of attention. Stanley decisively says them, "They won't come. Why not?" And he quickly says, "I tell you they won't come. Why didn't they come last night if they were coming?" So here, this is the first time where the dynamics really appear on a level of language to shift, because he starts to engage in these faulty delusions. He's convincing himself here that everything is okay, and he's trying to come up with logically faulty reasons why they won't be coming. So here he appears just as susceptible to self-deception as Meg is, and that's alarming for us because Stanley's obviously significantly more intelligent than her. So that self-reassurance brings him into the category of characters that deceive themselves.